So as Kirsten had queued up, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the initial concepts for value pricing consideration within the I-5 and 205 corridors. And she also mentioned that these are not proposals, and I really want to underscore that. What will a proposal look like? It's one that's going to include not only the general concept, but also specific projects and policies. And you're not going to hear about projects or policies today, because that's not where we're at yet in this process. We're at the very beginning of understanding as to what these concepts, as applied, would have for potential benefits as well as detriments for the regional system, and specifically for the two corridors that are under evaluation. As we start getting through concepts and understanding where some of those benefits are likely to be emphasized and where their detriments need to be resolved, then we can start talking about specific projects, how those would be applied in the field, what would be the impact upon individual travelers in those communities or corridors, as well as those who reside and work in those communities that are adjacent to those corridors as well. Those are subsequent levels of analysis. What we're trying to do at the very beginning here is to give ourselves a baseline to work from, not only from a comparison to a scenario where there are no tolls being applied to the two corridors, but also in terms of where we're going to go in terms of the evaluation of that and the development of specific projects and policies that would enable those concepts. So, as Kirsten had mentioned, there are primarily three general categories of concepts that are under evaluation. The first is tolling all of the lanes of a highway. The second is converting one of the general purpose lanes and tolling that. And then finally, constructing a brand new lane and tolling that. And we'll talk about those and what those mean in terms of how those concepts will be applied in a moment. Of course, in order to understand the effectiveness of these three concepts, what we also need to have is an understanding as to what the baseline of what we're comparing against would look like. So at the beginning, one of the concepts that's being put through the regional model is an understanding of the baseline in the year 2027. And that includes all of the population and employment growth that's projected for the region as well, so that we get an understanding as to what it would look like in the year 2027 with these types of potential concepts being applied. Within this would include projects that are already identified within the regional transportation plan that have been approved and would be funded for construction. And so as a result, those projects are a part of all of the various concepts being applied. So we have a common base of understanding. What's different between the baseline versus the others is the implementation of tolls. In this scenario, in the baseline scenario, there are no tolls on either I-5 or I-205. So the very first one, shall we say the more comprehensive concept as applied would be to price the entirety of all lanes of travel across that roadway facility. So that would mean for every lane of travel on I-5 or every lane of travel on I-205, you would be subject to the payment of a toll, and the anticipation is you would have the benefits of higher levels of travel time reliability and travel time benefits in exchange for the payment of that toll. As you can see on the slide up here, there are a few facilities that have already been implemented around the country that involve all lanes being tolled. One of the members of the public who gave comment at the very beginning of this session highlighted some of those. They are primarily facilities that have been constructed for the purpose of building a brand new facility and using tolls as a way of paying back bonds for the construction. But that's not the only application where that occurs. On the SR 520 bridge, for example, in Seattle, there was the implementation of variable pricing on an pre-existing corridor in order to manage traffic demand as well as to generate revenue for the construction of a new bridge. These sort of scenarios are relatively few and far between, even though the potential benefits for them are pretty significant. One of the other members of the public who spoke at the very beginning of this session indicated that value pricing is at its core an economics equation, and it is trying to provide some balance between supply and demand through the use of pricing, just like we would for any other consumer good or even public utility for that matter. We have a very limited amount of supply in our facilities, and pricing through the motor fuel tax and vehicle registration is a poor proxy for use. Value pricing across all lanes of travel would provide for an ability to create balance between that price that someone would pay, hence bringing some balance to demand as well as to supply. And so the benefits would be accrued to all the users of that facility. Every user of the facility would be subject to the potential benefits of travel time reliability, greater levels of efficiency, because all are part of the program for being subject to those benefits. A couple of the other elements that you're going to see carry through for all of the strategies is the concept of throughput. So if you happen to have some familiarity with traffic engineering, you might know about the backward bending curve. And the backward bending curve is this dot map that shows the relationship between speeds and the amount of volume that you can carry through in any given point of a highway lane facility. As was mentioned by someone earlier, a typical highway lane carries 1,800 to 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane. That means if you were to just look at a lane, one point in time, you could measure up to 2,000 vehicles crossing that point. But when we start getting into saturated conditions, when traffic congestion gets really, really bad, we're not actually pushing through 2,000 vehicles per hour. We're only pushing a fraction of that, potentially only as much as 1,000 vehicles per hour through that lane. And that creates a problem. Penny had started us right at the very beginning of this meeting by saying if, in the case of an emergency, we should exit the doors that are around us. We know these doors are easily capable of carrying us and allowing us to enter and exit this room. Why? Because we all got in here and we didn't have to push anyone around to get here. In case of emergency, I'm not entirely sure that that would have occurred. We might all be rushing for those doors at the same time, and all of a sudden those doors are maybe not as efficient at pushing us through. So what does that mean? Well, even in a priced roadway scenario, there may be situations where the roadway facility, even fully priced, isn't necessarily able to carry its highest level and its most efficient level. And that's one of the implementation issues that we'll look at as we start moving from the concepts to projects to policies, is understanding where are there still constraints in the system that would lend itself towards reducing the overall effectiveness of that pricing scenario. There are other implementation issues as it pertains to priced lanes across for a roadway facility. Those can include public acceptance. There are issues related to what is currently available that is untold, now being subject to a potential price. That is a very real and very present issue that should be considered throughout the process, and it will be considered throughout the scope of work. Additionally, there are some issues relating to federal law. Right now, to implement price lanes across price roadways across all lanes of travel would require the concurrence of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. So she currently would need to sign off on this proposal if it was to be implemented on I-5 and I-205 under the context of what's called the Value Pricing Pilot Program. And that's where often the phrase value pricing comes from, is from the name of that program that was implemented in the 1990s. Finally, when we're talking about price roadways, all lanes of travel, there is an impact potentially on diversion. Since the entrance to that facility and exit of that facility is subject to price, regardless as to how you're using that facility, then there is the potential for diversion to either other routes or, in a very positive context, to diversion to other modes of travel. So understanding that through this process is part of the intent. So that's price roadways. Let's move now over into price lanes. What's the difference between those? Well, instead of being subject to all lanes of travel being subject to the toll, in a price lane scenario, only one lane of travel is subject to a toll, or potentially it could be two lanes. There are variations as we start moving from concept to project. But in the context of the first assessment and understanding, we're talking about this in the sense of one lane of travel. There are two variations within the concepts being evaluated. The first is converting a general purpose lane, so not changing the overall laneage on either of the two corridors. The second is to construct a new lane of travel. There are some differences amongst these. This has been a very typically applied a system of value pricing in the United States in particular. So there are over 45 operational priced lane facilities in the United States. They're called express lanes in most communities, and certain communities are called managed lanes. If you see either of those two terms, that's what this is talking about. But even amongst all those 45 different express lanes and managed lanes, there are significant variations in how those have been applied both as projects and as policies. And so as a result, it's often a word of caution about comparing one facility to the other without understanding its context. It's like airports. Every airport has essentially the same function, to get you onto a plane that will get you to another airport. But if you travel as much as I do, every airport looks completely different from one another, and they have different, understandings of their functionality and level of comfort. It's much the same with express lanes. Some are going to be highly designed for your comfort, and others are not. So just a word of caution about comparing them. In terms of the benefits, unlike in a priced roadway scenario, the priced express lane users are the ones who are going to primarily benefit from the travel time, reliability, and efficiency benefits of value pricing. General purpose lane users may have a limited level of benefit from those facilities, or there may even be scenarios when that there's either no impact or even potentially a slightly worsened impact. It all depends on how that concept is applied as a project and as a policy. But for those who are in the express lane, they are utilizing higher levels of, or enjoying higher levels of travel time reliability, higher levels of throughput. And when you start looking at the overall footprint of the freeway facility, you're getting more and more vehicles through, so that backward bending curve is no longer as applicable. You are able to encourage greater levels of vehicle throughput and also person throughput if you are encouraging the use of buses and carpools in that facility. So what are some of the implementation issues of priced lanes? Well, certainly when you're converting one general purpose lane into an express lane, there may be the situation where conditions worsen in the general purpose lanes, and that certainly could occur at the peak shoulders, what we call the peak shoulders. That means the time right before the peak hour versus and the times immediately after the peak hour. There are additional issues related to federal approval and public acceptance, much the same as it would be with a priced roadway when converting a general purpose lane. There are also issues of lane continuity. A good example is on I-5. When you start, when you're heading northbound, as you start approaching 405 by the south of downtown Portland, if you're in the left lane of travel, if you were to not exit that lane of travel, you'd be exiting at City Center. You wouldn't be continuing on I-5. So there are considerations as to what a conversion would look like and how it's applied in the field. One other element that's worth noting is that Oregon law currently has some restrictions in terms of truck use, in terms of what lanes they can utilize. So when we're talking about a priced lane, if we want trucks and freight to be able to benefit from travel time reliability and efficiency uses of that lane, there may have to be an examination as to what the requirements are for those trucks and be able to use that left lane. By comparison, building a brand new lane and pricing that is a different scenario. First, you're increasing capacity, so we don't anticipate problems with general purpose lane uses. So in the situations where new lanes of travel have been created and priced, there are also consequent benefits to the general purpose lane users as well, even those who don't pay a toll, based upon the addition of capacity in that corridor. There are also, it's the only scenario where it can be built by right under federal law, so you don't need the explicit signature of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation in order to implement that type of concept. One element that's worth considering, though, in terms of a newly constructed price lane is, of course, the cost of providing that newly constructed price lane. It's not going to be easy in all areas, and it certainly could be very, very costly in certain areas. So that's one consideration with that application. So we're going to conclude here with what are the concepts being applied? How are we looking at this through different modeling exercises, and how are we looking at it in terms of other types of feasibility assessment that go well beyond just simply modeling findings? The first is to look at all four of those concepts: baseline, priced roadways, converted price lane, and added price lane, as concepts to be applied across the entirety of both corridors. And so those are the first four scenarios that you see up here. But as Kirsten had mentioned as well, we are also looking at it from a combination aspect. We already understand that the conditions on I-205 are very different from the conditions on I-5. That's not only just the physical environment in which they're located, but it's also the travel markets. It's also the communities in which they reside. And so some initial ideas in terms of what the concept combinations would be examined include looking at combinations of perhaps a baseline condition on one corridor and then a price scenario on another. So in the first on the lower left, you can see it is looking at baseline on I-5 and then combining that with constructing and pricing a new lane on I-205. The second combination is looking at pricing the entirety of I-5, but then not doing any additional level of improvement beyond the baseline on I-205. The third scenario on that bottom combination is the conversion of a general purpose lane on I-5, and then the priced roadway scenario on I-205, And then finally, the last scenario is the conversion of a general purpose lane on I-5, and then coupling that with the provision of new capacity of subpriced lane on I-205. These are some of the initial combinations that we would look at in terms of these concepts. And certainly, by the time we come back to PAC number 3 meeting at the end of February, it's going to be examining a lot of the initial findings of these concepts as evaluated, as well as the context and conditions by which we would then start coming forward with concepts that could eventually move to projects.